Marlon was still shouting when the island moved. I don't mean the boat drifted or fog made distance difficult. I mean the island itself slid sideways across Blackwater Lake, like something on the far shore had put a hand under the earth and pushed. Pines leaned and righted themselves without breaking. The old red campsite sign for 7 tipped once, twice, and vanished below the black surface without a splash. "Don't listen to him," Marlon yelled, though his mouth wasn't the only one speaking. My uncle's voice came from the water behind me, not from one place, from the wet slap against the canoe hull, from the metal rings in the bow, from the lake inside my ears. "Evan, you already know where you belong." The notebook in my lap had gone damp and soft with spray. My own handwriting was running down the page in dark threads. Names bled into each other. Dates, coordinates, little marks beside the ones who had heard paddling when there was no boat. Marlon raised the flare gun with both hands. He wasn't aiming at the lake. He was aiming at me. His face looked grey in the moonlight, old and terrified and almost kind. "I'm sorry," he said. Something huge turned beneath us. Not swimming, waking. The canoe lifted on a long, slow back that could not possibly have fit under so little water. Then every voice on the lake began to say my name at once. It started 3 nights before that. I came back to Blackwater Lake because I needed money badly enough to call grief an opportunity. That sounds colder on paper than it felt at the time, but not by much. My Uncle Cal had died 6 weeks earlier, officially of exposure, after failing to return from a route inspection between the main compound and the northern portage cut. He was 63, wiry, careful, and more competent in the bush than anyone I had ever known. Men like that did not simply get turned around and freeze unless something had first convinced them they were no longer where they thought they were. That was the unofficial version anyway. Up there, nobody said it plainly. They let silence do the work. I had not seen my uncle in 11 years. We spoke once every Christmas, twice if one of us remembered a birthday. He had no children. My father was dead. My mother had passed the winter before. That left me as the nearest blood relative and, to my private astonishment, sole inheritor of Holt Wilderness Outfitters. The main lodge, the warehouse, the dock, 4 aluminum fishing boats, 19 cedar strip canoes, 2 staff cabins, 1 old generator shed, a fuel tank caged in chain link, 3 mapped portage trails, and 5 licensed wilderness camps spread across the connected lakes. I told the lawyer I would take a week to review the estate. In truth, I had 3 days before my sister learned what I had done with the money she had trusted me to hold for her house closing. I didn't gamble in casinos. People hear the word and picture neon, cards, cheap carpeting. Mine was uglier and quieter than that. Sports apps, offshore sites, a run of losses followed by the kind of frantic private optimism that makes a man feel briefly like fate owes him a correction. By the time I understood that debt has no morality, I was $28,000 short, living inside my phone, and telling my sister bank transfer delays happen all the time. The outfitter wasn't sentimental to me. It was acreage, buildings, boats, sale value. I drove north in a rented pickup with a duffel bag, a box of old legal papers, and a stomach that kept tightening whenever my sister texted. The farther I went, the more the roads thinned and the radio blurred into weather and static. Spruce crowded the shoulder. The lakes appeared between trunks in flashes of dull steel. In late May, the whole district looked unfinished, as if winter had peeled back only yesterday and forgotten its tools behind. The compound sat on a point of land where 2 narrow channels widened into Blackwater Lake. The main lodge was timber-framed and dark with age, 2 stories with a wraparound porch and an office stuck onto one side like an afterthought. The warehouse stood back among jack pine, doors big enough for trailers. To the right of the dock was the fuel cage, and a hand pump under a tin awning. Past that, a staff bunkhouse with screened windows and a collapsed picnic table. Behind everything, the portage trail entered the trees in a clean, dark line. No one came out to greet me. The lawyer had warned me there was one remaining guide, a local named Marlon Reed, who had agreed to keep an eye on the place until the estate settled. But there were no trucks parked outside the bunkhouse and no movement on the water. The lake lay flat and black under a white sky, not reflective so much as absorptive, like a sheet of dark mineral laid over a depth too complicated to measure. I unloaded half my things, found the office unlocked, and did the kind of inspection a fool does when he doesn't yet know what matters. The office smelled of mildew, paper, and spilled gas. Route maps were tacked to a corkboard in layers. A barometer hung crooked over a filing cabinet. On the desk sat an old adding machine, a ledger book, and a brass bell clouded with green. There was no welcome note, no estate packet, no framed family photo designed to stir anything in me. Just drawers, dust, and the awareness that the place had continued existing for years without needing my permission. I should have started there. I know that now. Instead, I walked back outside, saw one of the canoes already half in the water, and decided to take a look around. It felt practical. I had inherited shoreline. I wanted to see it. The canoe was lighter than I expected. The life jackets were stiff with age, but serviceable. I took one, more out of habit than caution, and shoved off from the dock with a paddle that had my uncle's initials burned into the shaft. The first thing I noticed on the lake was how sound carried incorrectly. That's the closest I can get to it. Small things reached me from too far away, while larger ones vanished. I could hear water ticking from a pine snag across the inlet, but not the scrape of my own paddle when it brushed the gunwale. Once, halfway along the eastern shoreline, I heard what I thought was a child coughing somewhere behind me. I turned and saw only open water, and the compound reduced to toy dimensions at the point. I did a slow circuit of the near shore. There were old mooring posts half submerged, a beaver lodge at the mouth of the southern channel, and one section of exposed rock where someone had driven iron rings into the stone decades earlier. The trees came right down to the water, almost everywhere else. No cottages, no roads, no power lines, just black water, muskeg smell, and the unnerving impression that the lake was larger than the maps suggested. I was maybe 40 minutes out when the weather changed. A line of darker cloud thickened over the west. Wind rose just enough to wrinkle the surface. I headed back, irritated with myself for wasting time, and paddled harder than I needed to. As I drew near the dock, I saw a man standing on shore beside the office steps. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing chest waders and an old red guide jacket faded nearly pink at the seams. He did not wave. I bumped the canoe against the dock and climbed out with the gracelessness of someone trying not to appear out of practice. The man watched me the way you watch a stranger handling a firearm. "You Evan?" he asked. I said I was. "Marlon Reed." We shook hands. His grip was dry and hard. He glanced once at the canoe, then at the lake behind me, then back at me with an expression so brief I almost missed it. It wasn't surprise. It was something narrower and more private, like a man hearing a sound he hoped never to hear again. "You go out there?" he asked. "Just around the shoreline, on Blackwater." I laughed a little because it sounded like a trick question. "That is the lake, right?" He didn't answer the joke. He looked past me toward the office. "Come inside," he said. On the desk, where I would have sworn there had been nothing half an hour earlier, lay a long yellow envelope addressed in my uncle's block handwriting. Evan, read before anything else. Marlon remained by the door while I opened it. Inside was a single folded packet, several pages clipped together. At the top, in capitals, my uncle had written, "Rules for the compound and water routes. Do not treat these as local superstition." Below that, the first rule, 1. Never take a canoe onto Blackwater Lake before reading the rules. I read it twice, then looked up at Marlon. He had gone very still. "Well," I said, because I still thought my life belonged to ordinary categories. "That seems late." Something tapped at the office window. Not a branch, not a knuckle, more like the wet, hollow knock of wood against glass. Marlon did not turn to look. "Keep reading," he said, and for the first time since arriving, I felt the day shift under me by a degree too small to name and too large to ignore. The rest of the rules would have been absurd anywhere else, but inside that office, with the stale air, the maps, and Marlon standing like a man at a wake, they acquired the shape of bureaucracy. Not truth exactly. Something worse. Procedure. There were 17 in total, typed at some point, then marked over by my uncle in pencil and pen, as though the document had lived several lives and distrusted every one of them. Some were practical enough at first glance. 3. Keep emergency blankets in every boat cache. 5. Refuel the generator before dark if storms are forecast. 8. Never send guests across the North Channel if fog forms before noon. Others were not. 2. If someone waves from the far shore of Blackwater Lake, do not wave back. 6. Never count the canoes after sunset. 9. If you hear paddling but see no boat, stop moving until it passes. 11. Do not allow anyone to camp at Site 7. 14. If a guest returns with an extra passenger, charge only for the original group. 17. If you find wet footprints in the office, lock the door and wait for daylight. Do not follow them. At the bottom, in a sharper hand than the rest, my uncle had added, "The rules are not complete. If Marlon tells you something not written here, listen." "That a joke?" I asked. "No. Is this to scare tourists? We never gave the full list to tourists." I laid the pages down. My uncle believed this. Marlon's eyes moved to Rule 1 and away again. Your uncle believed what he saw. That answer irritated me more than if he had leaned into the performance. It felt rehearsed, pious in a local way. Every remote place likes to imagine it keeps older laws than the rest of the world. I had spent enough summers in northern Ontario as a kid to know how ordinary weather and distance become myth when there are no streetlights to correct perspective. Still, I asked the reasonable question, what happens if someone breaks one? Marlon took a long time before saying, "Depends which one. I already broke the first." "Yes, and?" His jaw worked once. "You're here." That was the first of many answers I would only understand after it was too late to be useful. Marlon showed me the compound before dusk, speaking in the flat, efficient voice of a man trying to front-load necessity before night interfered. The warehouse held stacked Duluth packs, barrels of stove fuel, spare paddles, and a row of canoes suspended upside down from ceiling racks. The guest bunk rooms upstairs in the lodge were musty but clean. The kitchen still had dry goods in labeled tins. Behind the office was a locked records room containing decades of permits, route logs, maintenance invoices, and shelves of my uncle's journals dating back to the late 80s. "Why the lock?" I asked. "Cal kept all records there. And the key." Marlon handed it over without comment. He walked me down to the fuel dock last. The west wind had freshened. Small waves slapped the pilings, and somewhere out on the lake, a loon called once. then stopped so abruptly it sounded interrupted. "You planning to sell?" Marlon asked. "That's the idea." His face didn't change, but he looked toward the northern channel, where the water narrowed between stands of cedar. "Then sell fast. You don't seem broken up about the family legacy. It isn't yours the way you think." I would have asked what that meant, but a cracking sound exploded from the tree line behind us. We both turned. A dead spruce at the edge of the yard leaned outward, hesitated, and came down in a shower of needles and gray bark. I had been standing under it less than a minute earlier, looking at an old outboard motor propped against a stump. The trunk hit hard enough to jar the dock. Marlon stared at the fallen tree, then at me. "You see that?" I said, half laughing from adrenaline. "I did. That was lucky." He said nothing. That night I slept badly in the upstairs room at the lodge. The mattress bowed in the middle, and the building made noises I couldn't assign to settling. Several times I woke convinced someone was pacing the porch below, but when I looked out, the yard was empty, washed in moonlight and moving shadows. Once I heard water striking wood in a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a paddle laid flat against the lake. By morning, the sky had cleared to a hard blue. My phone had no service. I made coffee in my uncle's kitchen and began the practical work of valuing the property. I photographed buildings, noted rot, checked serial numbers on boats and motors, and tried not to think about my sister, who had texted at 6:12 a.m., "Lawyer says funds should clear today." Around noon, 2 guests arrived in a dusty Subaru. Middle-aged brothers from Sudbury with a fishing reservation my uncle had evidently booked months before dying. I considered sending them away, but needed the cash, and more honestly, wanted confirmation that normal life still operated here. I checked them into one of the near camps on Alder Run, explained weather, bears, water levels, and omitted every one of the written rules. They were launching from the dock when the older one glanced across Blackwater and said, "Who's your buddy?" No one stood there that I could see. "Far bank," he said, squinting. "Blue jacket, waving like hell." My stomach tightened. Rule 2. I almost told him not to respond, but the younger brother had already raised a hand in an embarrassed half-wave, the sort city people give strangers to keep things smooth. The far shore remained a green-black line broken by rock. No blue jacket, no person. "You boys get going," Marlon said from behind us so suddenly we all flinched. They laughed it off and shoved away. Marlon watched them until they vanished into the channel. Did he wave? "I think so." Marlon muttered something I didn't catch. When I asked, he only said, "Keep them off Blackwater after dark." That afternoon I went into the records room. My uncle's journals were not diaries in the ordinary sense. They were dated notebooks full of route conditions, maintenance notes, guest incidents, weather shifts, wildlife sightings, and interleaved pages headed simply occurrences. Some entries described little beyond unease, paddling heard west of dock, no craft visible, waited 30 seconds, sound passed north to south against wind. Others were detailed enough to feel like depositions, names, times, distances, what someone saw, what they refused to admit they saw later. Every so often a rule appeared in the margins, amended, crossed out, restored. Rule 11, no guests at Site 7. Then years later, not enough. Mark trail, remove fire ring. Later still, do not approach Site 7 alone after rain. I spent hours reading until the light changed in the room without my noticing. When I looked up, the office windows had gone amber. Sunset. From somewhere in the warehouse came the scrape of something wooden shifting against concrete. I stood, remembering Rule 6 with a private, irritated smile. Never count the canoes after sunset. Fine. I had no intention of counting them at all. Then another sound came from outside, a shout from the dock. By the time I reached the porch, the brothers' rented aluminum boat was banging against the pilings. The younger one was trying to tie it one-handed, while the older sat in the stern, white-faced and bleeding from the scalp. "He fell," the younger brother said too quickly. "Tree branch, up by the Narrows." Marlon was already there with the first aid kit. The gash looked wrong for a branch. It was curved, almost clean, as if something narrow and hard had struck him along the hairline. He kept glancing over the younger brother's shoulder toward the water. "I heard paddling," he said before his brother could stop him. "No boat, just right alongside us." Then Steve waved at somebody on shore and I waved at nobody, Steve snapped, too fast. Marlon cleaned the wound without arguing. "You stay in the lodge tonight," he said. "You don't go back out." Neither brother objected. After dark, the wind rose again. We ate canned stew in the kitchen. Steve kept touching the bandage on his head like he expected his hand to come away with more than blood. His brother, Neil, made a few brittle jokes and watched the windows. I noticed Marlon looking at them the way a triage nurse looks at men who may worsen before dawn. Near 10, the generator coughed once, and the lights dimmed. "I topped the fuel this morning," I said. Marlon set down his spoon. "Stay here." He went outside with a flashlight. Through the rain-dotted kitchen window, I saw the beam slice across the yard, wobble at the fuel cage, then stop. Minutes passed. When he returned, his jacket was wet, and he looked angrier than afraid. "Line was shut off," he said. "By who?" He looked at Steve. "No," Steve said at once. "I haven't left this room." Marlon studied him, then me. "Doesn't matter. The storm should have hit us full sometime around midnight. I know this because I had checked the radar before losing signal in town, and because the air had that charged, metallic pressure that usually precedes a northern blow. Instead, the wind shifted sharply east. Rain passed south. Thunder rolled around the lake in a wide arc and never crossed overhead. From the upstairs window, I watched the cloud wall move away from the property, as neatly as if some boundary in the air had redirected it. In the flash of distant lightning, I saw someone standing at the end of the dock. A tall shape, still, watching the lodge. I blinked and it was gone. The next morning, Steve's fever had broken. The brothers packed early and left without fishing their second day. As Neil loaded the car, he said to me quietly, "You should check your shoreline." "For what?" He hesitated. "For boats." We had 19 canoes in inventory. At least, that was the number in the ledger. I went to the warehouse after sunrise to verify, meaning only to get organized. The first canoe I touched slipped on its rack and came down fast enough to split my lip on the gunnel. I stumbled backward, just as a second boat, then a third, broke loose overhead and crashed where I had been standing. The rack bolts had sheared clean through. I sat on the floor with blood in my mouth and cedar splinters around my boots, understanding only one thing with certainty. Something on that property had already decided I was not to die by accident, and the feeling that came with that realization was not relief. A useful lie exists in families, especially unhappy ones. If enough time passes, the strange thing becomes a story, and if it becomes a story, then it can no longer alter the present tense. My uncle had always been the designated keeper of the strange thing. When I was young, adults referred to him with the fond, distancing respect reserved for men who choose isolation over ordinary life. Cal liked the bush too much. Cal never married because he preferred canoes to people. Cal had his own ideas about the lake. The phrase "his own ideas" did most of the heavy lifting. It made eccentricity sound harmless. It kept children from asking sharper questions. By the third day, I had read enough of his journals to understand that whatever else he had been, my uncle was not whimsical. He was meticulous. His entries about rule violations were separated from guest records and copied more than once, as if he feared loss, fire, or deliberate editing. He had created index cards by date and lake sector. Some referred to events I might have dismissed as folklore if not for the consistency and outcome. June 14, 1991. Temporary staff member launched onto Blackwater at dawn prior to orientation. Failed to report for breakfast. Canoe recovered near North Reeds. No body. August 3, 1998. Camper family ignored far shore wave. Father and daughter missing by next morning. Son found on island east of 7. Hypothermic. No recollection after sunset. May 29, 2007. Couple entered lake during opening week before guide briefing. Both vanished within 72 hours. Packs remained in cabin. Wet footprints in office. I stopped cataloguing after 27 disappearances because repetition had turned the entries from incidents into a system. Rule 1 was different from the others in one important respect. The consequence was never immediate. According to my uncle's notes, those who broke it did not drown on the spot or get pulled under in front of witnesses. They simply failed to remain in the world for long. Sometimes there were signs first. Voices, navigational confusion, people seen standing where no one should be. Then, within days, they were gone, no exceptions. Except me. I found the sentence in a journal from 4 years before my uncle died. It wasn't tucked away in shorthand or margin code. He had written it on a page by itself. If my nephew ever returns, the rules may not apply to him anymore. Beneath that, this is not good news. I sat alone in the records room, with the notebook open on my knees, and heard, or thought I heard, paddling outside the office wall. Not frantic strokes, slow, measured movement, keeping station just beyond the window. I did not go to look. Instead, I read backward through older journals until the handwriting changed. Then older still until I reached the summer I was 8 years old. There was very little of me in the family record. A sunburned kid in 2 photographs. My mother wrote dates in scrapbooks, not feelings. My father believed children should harden through benign neglect. What I remember from that summer had always been fragmentary. Mosquitoes whining in the bunkhouse screen. My uncle teaching me to feather a paddle. My mother screaming my name from the dock one night because I had wandered too far. The adult's relief when I turned up the next day wrapped in a blanket and refusing to speak. That was the family version. A child gets lost in the woods. Searchers look. Child hides or falls asleep somewhere stupid. Child returns in shock and later remembers nothing. The embarrassing truth becomes an anecdote. My uncle's journals told a different story. July 18th. Evan missing after dusk. Last seen near Portage Trail, but dog will not track beyond Blackwater shore. July 19th, 2:10 a.m. Heard child laughing from lake. Search party terminated at storm onset. July 19th, 5:40 p.m. Child reappeared at fuel dock, barefoot, core temp dangerously low, no signs of exposure, consistent with duration. Refuses to answer when asked where he has been. Keeps asking who the woman in the water was. No woman present. I did not remember asking that. A later note in the same journal was underlined twice. There is a mark behind his left ear. Not leech bite. Not hook cut. Circular bruise with central pale ring. Same as M. Foster, 1987. I stood abruptly enough to make the chair scrape. My left hand went to the skin behind my ear before I could stop it. There had always been a small discoloration there. a pale spot inside a darker crescent. I had thought it was a birthmark or a scar from childhood. Something unimportant becomes invisible when you stop granting it context. Marlon found me half an hour later in the office washroom, angling a mirror to inspect it under fluorescent light. "So he told you," he said. I turned too fast. "You knew." I knew enough. That I disappeared as a kid. That my uncle wrote I might not be subject to the rules. Marlon leaned against the doorframe without crossing into the room. Cal spent 20 years waiting to see whether he was right. About what? That what took you didn't let you go. Not all the way. The washroom light hummed above us. I could smell bleach and old plumbing. Outside, a canoe bumping softly at the dock sounded like careful breathing. "You people keep saying things like that," I said, hearing my own voice sharpen, "like there's a script I'm behind on. If you know something, say it in plain English." Marlon looked tired suddenly, and much older than I had first taken him for. "Plain English is, you should have died in 1996. I laughed once, without humor. "That's your bedside manner. That's your history." He left before I could answer. I spent the afternoon turning the compound upside down for evidence that would place all of this back inside a category I understood. Carbon monoxide? Mold exposure? Some local predatory scam built around the inheritance? The effort was almost comforting. I checked the generator housing, water pump, propane lines, the moldy corners of the lodge basement. I found rot, mouse nests, and a cracked window in the bunkhouse. Nothing that could explain why 3 separate journals from different decades contained the same descriptions of absent paddlers and extra passengers who left no footprints on land. Toward evening, I took one of the route maps down from the office wall and spread it on the desk. The compound sat on the south edge of Blackwater Lake, which fed east into Alder Run through a rocky channel and north into 3 smaller lakes by way of the portage system. Site 7 was marked on a peninsula west of the main body, reachable by water or a cut trail that my uncle had later crossed out in red. Someone had penciled a faint second shoreline around part of Blackwater, not parallel, overlapping, as if at certain times the lake had more than one edge. I was tracing it with my finger when I noticed the framed photograph tucked behind the map's lower corner. It showed my uncle, Marlon, and 3 younger guides standing in front of the warehouse. Behind them, elevated on sawhorses, was a canoe unlike the others. Darker wood, deeper hull, no visible registration number. My uncle had written on the back, "Recovered from 7, do not launch." There was also a boy in the far background, half cut off by the frame. Me, probably 8 years old. I was facing the lake, not the camera. That alone might have meant nothing, but someone had drawn a pencil circle around my head and written one word beside it. Listening. I took the photograph to Marlon, in the cookhouse, where he was cleaning a fillet knife that had no fish smell on it. "What does this mean?" He barely glanced at the photo. "Cal started marking patterns after you came back." "Patterns of what?" "People the lake noticed." "That isn't an answer. It's the only safe one." I slapped the photograph onto the table harder than I meant to. "Enough with safe. My uncle dies. I inherit this place. I break the first rule, and instead of vanishing, I get, what? Protected? Watched? And every time something nearly happens to me, something worse happens to someone else. If you know why, say it." Marlon's expression changed in a way that scared me more than anger would have. It became pity. "Because it knows you," he said. "And because when the lake recognizes one of its own, it stops hunting and starts waiting." I don't remember deciding to leave the room. I only remember being outside, sucking cold air into lungs that felt too small, with the last light spread thin over Blackwater. The lake looked calm enough to insult me. A pair of mergansers moved across the surface near the reeds. Somewhere a branch cracked in the trees. Then, from the far shore, a figure lifted an arm and waved. This time I saw it clearly, too far for features. The posture was unmistakably human, casual almost, as if greeting a late arrival. The jacket might have been blue or green or black, depending on the light. The arm moved again. I did not wave back. The figure lowered its hand and stood there another 10 seconds before stepping behind a pine and not emerging. Marlon came onto the porch behind me. "You saw one?" "Yes." "Did it feel familiar?" I hated the question, because the answer arrived before I chose it. "Yes." Not visually. Not in the way you recognize a face. More like remembering the shape of a room in the dark. That night, I dreamed of my uncle standing thigh-deep in the lake behind the dock. He looked exactly as he had in the photograph, red jacket and all, except the waterline was wrong. It crossed his chest, and then his throat without his body sinking. When he spoke, his mouth filled with black water, and kept speaking anyway. "You weren't brought back," he said. "You were set aside." I woke to pounding on the lodge door. Marlon stood outside with a flashlight and shotgun. "Guide's missing," he said. "What guide?" "Tom from the north cabin. He was supposed to bring down supplies at dusk. Boat came back. Tom didn't." Behind him, out on Blackwater, something moved against the moonlit surface with the slow certainty of a canoe being paddled by no one at all. And for the first time, instead of thinking, "What is that?" I had the far worse thought. What if it has been waiting for me to remember it? Tom's canoe returned upside down, not capsized. Returned. Marlon insisted on the distinction, and after what I saw that night, I understood why. The boat did not drift into the dock tangled in weeds or carried by wind. It came gliding through the moon track from the North Channel, as if guided, turned once in a slow arc, and knocked gently against the piling's hull up, like a hand asking entrance. Marlon had already lit the flood lamp by the time I reached the dock. The canoe's painter line was neatly coiled under the stern strap. Tom's pack sat cinched beneath the center thwart. His paddle was laid inside lengthwise with the blade clean. No signs of panic, no sign of a struggle, just absence arranged with care. "Call the OPP?" I asked. "And tell them what?" "That your guy vanished." Marlon crouched and ran his hand along the canoe's underside. "By the time they get here, they'll find tracks leading nowhere and maybe a footprint on the dock if we're lucky." He straightened. "Tom heard paddling yesterday. Did he mention it to you?" "No. He mentioned it to Neil after supper. Neil told me before they left." "You think hearing something makes you disappear? I think being noticed does. We searched anyway, because refusing would have meant accepting too much at once. We took the aluminum boat with the small outboard and ran the near shoreline under a moon thin enough to flatten everything. The beam of Marlon's spotlight found reeds, rock, low branches, and once the white face of a deer standing belly deep in a marsh inlet, watching us with the detached patience of something not bound by our emergency. At the mouth of the West Bay, near the route to Site 7, the engine died. Marlon cursed softly and tried the starter again. It whined without turning over. Gas was fine, plug wire connected. Nothing obvious. The lake around us had gone very still, the surface so smooth that our boat seemed pinned on it rather than floating. Then I heard it. Paddling. Close on the starboard side. One stroke. Pause. Another. The sound of a wooden blade entering water with no splash at the catch. Just a thick, intimate dip and draw. "There's nobody there," I whispered. "Stop moving," Marlon said. "Rule 9. He snapped off the spotlight. The sudden dark had weight. I froze with one hand on the gunwale. The unseen paddler passed us at the pace of someone conserving energy over distance. Stroke, glide, stroke, glide. The sound moved ahead of the boat, then slightly left, then away into the bay. No wake touched us. No silhouette interrupted the starlight. Only when it had faded completely did the engine start on the first pull. We found nothing of Tom but his flashlight on a rock shelf north of the dock, still dry, batteries removed, and placed beside it like offerings. At dawn, I called the provincial police from the landline and reported him missing in the blandest terms possible. A search coordinator promised to send someone up by afternoon if weather held. After hanging up, I stood in the office and understood with sick clarity why my uncle's journals had become more precise and less hopeful over time. Procedures existed to protect institutions from chaos, not to explain it. You could report a missing guide, a storm, a hazard. You could not report that a canoe had come home more tidily than some men did. While Marlon prepared for the official search, I returned to the journal from my childhood summer and forced myself to keep reading. There were entries after my return I had not seen before because I had stopped at the mark behind my ear. July 20th. Evan responsive but distant. Does not answer to his name immediately. Watches water whenever conversation stops. July 21. Asked whether she was still under the dock. No woman visible. July 23. Marlon says keep boy away from 7. Agreed. Too late? July 26. Tested old instruction from 1974. No reaction from him. New possibility. Marked individuals invert certain thresholds. That phrase sat in me like a hook. Invert certain thresholds. At the back of the journal was an envelope taped to the inside cover. In it, folded into quarters, was a child's drawing on lined paper. Crayon lake, stick trees, a boxy lodge with smoke from the chimney, one small canoe on black water, and beneath it, a larger shape filling the lake like a second shadow. Above the canoe was a figure with yellow hair. Below it, many pale faces. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, Evan drew this after we got home. I did not remember drawing it. When the OPP officer finally arrived, he was younger than I expected and more annoyed by the drive than alarmed by the disappearance. He took statements, looked over Tom's canoe, asked about drinking, weather, prior conflicts, and whether Tom had a girlfriend likely to know something the employer didn't. Marlon answered with a patience that had steel under it. I said as little as possible. The officer's name was Bouchard. He had kind eyes and the posture of a man trying not to catch local superstition by proximity. When I mentioned my uncle's death, he said, "Remote work attracts stories," in a tone that meant he considered that explanatory. Before leaving to coordinate volunteers from town, he asked if there were any restricted areas on the property. Site 7, Marlon and I said together. Bouchard raised an eyebrow. Why? Bad ground, Marlon said. Old sink near the fire ring, I added. Both were lies, or at best outdated fragments of one. By late afternoon, the search had spread northward. Boats moved through the channels in slow combing patterns. Voices traveled over water. Every now and then, the radio on the office desk crackled with location updates from men who all sounded closer than they were. I should have stayed put. Instead, I took the cut trail towards Site 7. There are decisions that feel chosen, and decisions that feel resumed, as though you are stepping back into a movement that began without you. That walk belonged to the second kind. I told myself I was checking the old fire ring in case Tom had come through there. But when my boots found the narrow path behind the warehouse and the air changed under the cedar canopy, some older, deeper instinct settled over me. Something like recognition wearing the mask of dread. The trail had not been maintained in years. Moss swallowed sections of it. Broken boardwalk slats sank into peat. Orange flagging tape hung in tatters from branches at shoulder height. Faded, nearly white. About half a mile in, I found a weathered sign nailed to a jack pine. No camping beyond this point. The lower half had been hacked away. Farther on, another sign faced the opposite direction, as if meant only for those leaving. Do not carry water back from 7. No explanation. The trees thinned, and the smell changed from cedar and leaf mold to something colder, mineral, with a sweet rot under it. The camp appeared all at once on a low tongue of land. 3 flattened tent pads, a broken picnic table, stone fire ring choked with fern, and a rusted steel cash box bolted to a post. Beyond it lay Blackwater, wider here, the far shore lost in a strange pale haze despite the clear day. The water around Site 7 was darker than anywhere else I had seen, not by reflection or depth alone, but by texture, as if the lake's surface had been burnished smoother here than wind should allow. Tom was not there, but something had been. Wet footprints crossed the packed earth near the fire ring and stopped at the cash box. Bare feet, adult size, too long in the toes. Water still sat inside them, trembling though no rain had fallen. I backed away, every part of me insisting I should not turn my back on the shore. Then I heard my name spoken softly behind me. Evan, my uncle's voice, not exact, but close enough to collapse my spine with cold. I turned. No one stood there, only the empty tent pads and the broken table. Again, Evan, this time from the water. A shape moved beneath the surface close to shore, pale and vertical, not swimming but standing, where nothing could stand. I saw what might have been a face tilt upward through the black. I ran. The trail back seemed wrong in small ways, longer, bending where it had been straight. Once I passed the same split cedar stump twice. Once I heard footsteps matching mine half a second late. By the time I burst out behind the warehouse, soaked in sweat, I could hear radios shouting all over the compound. Tom had been found. He was sitting cross-legged on the main dock facing the lake, barefoot, hands resting neatly on his knees. Search teams had not brought him in. No one had seen him arrive. One moment the dock was empty, the next he was there, as if uncovered by a change in light. I pushed through the cluster of volunteers and nearly didn't recognize him. Not because his features had changed, but because his expression had gone strangely unoccupied. His eyes tracked movement, but nothing seemed to settle behind them. "Tom," I said. He looked at me, and for an instant, terror flooded his face so purely that I almost stepped back. Then it was gone. "They told me not to come back yet," he whispered. "Who told you?" He glanced toward Blackwater. His lips trembled. "The ones that lost you the first time." Everyone around us fell silent. Marlon closed his eyes like a man hearing a sentence confirmed. Tom began to cry without making a sound. That night, Marlon locked every exterior door in the lodge and brought a shotgun into the dining room. He told the volunteers to sleep in shifts. No one argued. Around midnight, while the others dozed in chairs or pretended to, I found Marlon alone on the back porch, staring toward the invisible line of Site 7. "You knew I'd go there," I said. "Yes, you could have stopped me." "No," he said. "I don't think I could." I waited. After a long time, he said, "When you vanished as a boy, Cal and I went looking where the others wouldn't. Out past 7, we found a canoe tied to nothing. Your shoes were inside, and there was singing under the water." He rubbed a hand over his mouth. "When you came back, Cal wanted to believe you were lucky. I knew luck doesn't leave marks." What am I supposed to be? He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw no hatred in him yet, only dread shaped by years. Something they never finished with, he said. Inside the lodge, Tom began screaming in his sleep. By morning, Tom remembered almost nothing he could tell in a straight line. He sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in blankets despite the warmth, and answered questions, as if each one had to pass through water before reaching him. He remembered unloading supplies at the north cabin. He remembered dusk on the lake. He remembered hearing someone paddle alongside his canoe and assuming it was Marlin, because the strokes matched an old guide rhythm. Slow, efficient, blade close to hull. He remembered a voice asking whether the owner's nephew had arrived. After that, gaps. Sometimes he said he'd been on an island with no trees and many lanterns. Sometimes he said he never left the boat. Once he looked at me so fixedly, I had to turn away and said, "You were already there." Bouchard came back, saw the state Tom was in, and declared him dehydrated, shocked, and unfit to continue work. He offered hospital transport. Tom refused with a brittle panic that made even the officer uncomfortable. By noon, a volunteer drove him to his sister's place in town. Before leaving, Tom asked Marlon not to let me go near the west shore again. When Marlon came back from seeing them off, something in him had hardened past caution. "No more excursions," he said. "You don't get to order me around." "No, but I can tell you what Cal never wanted," said Plain. "If you stay, more people get noticed. That's convenient. It's observable." We were standing in the office. Rain freckled the window. The maps on the wall seemed suddenly theatrical, props in a room where the real geography had decided not to cooperate. "Observable how?" I asked. He ticked points off on his fingers, like a man forced into a briefing he had prayed to avoid. "You show up. Steve gets cracked open after waving at an empty shore. Tom disappears and comes back talking about you. Searchers report lights on islands that aren't charted. Storm line bends around the compound twice in 3 days. And every time something ought to happen to you, it slides. You think I'm causing it? I think you change what it reaches for." That should have sounded insane. Instead, it sounded almost technical, and that frightened me more. I said, "My uncle thought the rules might not apply to me." Marlon gave a humorless nod. "That's what he was afraid of." "What does that mean?" "It means the lake doesn't sort you with the rest anymore. Because I disappeared as a kid. Because you came back." He left me there and spent the afternoon moving gas cans into the warehouse, checking latches, and taking down 2 old trail signs from behind the lodge. I followed him once and saw he was not removing all signage indiscriminately. He was targeting specific markers. The red blazes that indicated the cut towards 7, the weathered arrow on the west path, a dock post with faded paint bands facing Blackwater. When I asked what he was doing, he said, "Reducing lines." That evening, a couple arrived unexpectedly with a reservation printout from my uncle's website. Newlyweds from Toronto. They had no idea the business was in partial disarray, and less idea still that they had chosen a destination where locals lowered their voices at gas stations. I wanted to turn them away, but they had driven 6 hours on rough roads and looked exhausted. Marlon said no, not politely, not tactfully, just no. Closed for emergency maintenance. The husband got indignant. The wife kept glancing at the lake, distracted by something I couldn't see. Marlon stepped between them and the dock with a protective aggression that made me understand how easily he could become the villain in someone else's version of events. When the couple finally left, tires spraying mud from the drive, I said, "You could have handled that better. If they launch, they die. You don't know that." He rounded on me so fast I flinched. I know more than you. It would have escalated from there if not for the whistle. 3 short blasts from the fuel dock, sharp and high. We both ran. No one stood there. But tied to the outer post was a canoe I had never seen before. The same dark one from the old photograph. Deeper in the hull than our rental boats. Slick with water, as if freshly hauled from the lake. No registration, no maker's stamp. Inside lay a child's orange life vest from the 90s and a single black feather pinned beneath the seat brace. My mouth went dry. That was in the warehouse picture. It was burned, Marlon said. Apparently not. He didn't touch the canoe. Back up. Why? Because it wasn't invited to shore. I almost laughed at the phrasing, but something in the air at the dock had changed. It felt thickened, pressurized. The usual shore smells, fuel, wet rope, cedar, were overlaid by the cold, sweet odor I had noticed at Site 7. Rotten clean water together. The canoe nudged once against the post, then again. No wave caused it. The lake around it was flat. Marlon took a boat hook from the rack and with careful disgust shoved the canoe away from the dock. It drifted back immediately, not carried, but choosing. He shoved harder. This time it slid several feet out, turned broadside against the current, and remained there. From somewhere under the dock, a child laughed. I don't have children. I am not especially sentimental about them. But there are sounds the body refuses to hear as unimportant, and that was one. It was brief and delighted, and deeply wrong because of where it came from. Marlon staggered backward. I stepped forward before thinking and looked down through the gap between planks. Black water, cross braces, the pale blur of my own reflection. Then another face rose beneath it from below, as if looking up through thick glass. Small, white, mouth open. I jerked back so hard I nearly went into the lake. Marlon grabbed my jacket and hauled me onto the dock boards. His hand shook violently. Inside! What did you see? I saw enough. He locked the dock gate for the first time since I'd arrived. That night he drank from my uncle's emergency whiskey in the kitchen and spoke more openly than he ever had. Maybe because the old canoe had broken some last agreement of silence between the lake and those who served it. Cal and I made the first sign for Site 7 in '92, he said. Back then the rules were simpler. Don't cross during fog. Don't answer voices. Don't bring back water from camps. Things like that. We thought we were keeping people safe from a place that had gone wrong. What changed? Rules started arriving instead of being made. I stared at him. Written where? In the office. In margins. Once on the back of a supply invoice. Cal would find a new instruction after an incident, and half the time it worked. Enough to trust. Enough to build habit. He drank again. Problem is, habit doesn't ask who it serves. He told me then about men I'd never heard of. Old guides before my uncle's time who had kept private lists. A woman named Jean Foster who returned from Blackwater in 1987 with the same mark behind her ear and hanged herself after writing pages of coordinates no map recognized. Another owner in the 70s who tried dynamiting part of the west shoreline and vanished 3 days later from his own porch. And you stayed? I asked. He looked offended by the simplicity of it. Someone had to watch the boundaries. Boundaries for what? For those it can't digest clean. The room seemed to tilt around that sentence. You think I'm one of those? I think you always were. I stood too fast and hit my thigh against the table. Then why not tell me the minute I got here? Because if you knew too much too soon, it might know what you know. That doesn't mean anything. It does here. He leaned forward, eyes bloodshot and terribly steady. I need you to understand something, Evan. I'm not protecting you. I'm protecting everyone else from whatever the lake remembers in you. There it was at last, the hostility stripped of politeness. Not personal hatred, functional fear. "Then why didn't you drive me off?" I asked quietly. He looked away. "Because Cal left instructions," he said. "About me?" "Yes." "What instructions?" He hesitated long enough to answer the question by not answering. "In case you came back, I was to keep you away from 7 until I knew which side had called you." I felt anger then, hot and clarifying. Which side? Marlon's expression gave me nothing. "Human," he said. Later, lying awake in the lodge, I heard footsteps on the porch below. Then the office bell ring once. A pause. Then twice. Not loud, not frantic, just patient. In the morning, the office door was still locked from the inside, but wet footprints crossed the floorboards to my uncle's desk and ended there. No return tracks. Under the blotter lay a note in my uncle's handwriting that had not been there the night before. "Marlon will do what he thinks is necessary. He is not wrong, but he is late." Below that, indifferent pen pressure, as if written by a less certain hand. "Do not let him take you to deep water before you understand why you survived." I carried the note to Marlon. He read it once and went grey. "You wrote this?" I asked. He whispered something like a prayer, not to God but to an old fear. When he finally looked at me, the decision in his face was almost visible. "I should have put you on the road day 1, he said. "Try." Instead of answering, he reached past me, opened the gun cabinet in the office, and took out my uncle's flare gun. Not to threaten me, to keep it close. That was when I realized he had crossed from wary guardian into active opposition, and whatever loyalty he had once felt to my uncle no longer outweighed his conviction that I was the greater danger. By evening he had moved the boat's ignition keys, hidden the dock lanterns, and pocketed the padlock key to the west storage shed where the old route markers were kept. He was preparing for a siege or an execution. I didn't know which. I only knew I could no longer wait for answers to arrive by note under a blotter. If the truth existed anywhere, it would be at Site 7, and Marlon, who had spent years keeping people away from it, had just convinced me there was nowhere else worth going. I went to Site 7 in rain hard enough to erase my trail. That mattered to me at the time. I thought concealment still belonged to human logic. I waited until Marlon took the aluminum boat east to check a supposed fuel leak at the North Cache, a task I strongly suspect he invented to move between points he considered safer than the compound. Then I slipped behind the warehouse, cut through the alders, and took the old portage with a flashlight, bolt cutters, and the keyring I had stolen from the office pegboard while he was in the generator shed. The woods drank sound. Rain on cedar boughs made a hush, like distant applause. By the time I reached the no camping sign, my jeans were soaked to the knee, and the air had gone markedly colder. I found the rusted cash box at 7, exactly where I'd seen it before, bolted to its post beside the dead fire ring. The padlock on it looked ancient, but the shackle came away at the first squeeze of the cutters. That startled me more than if it had resisted. I lifted the lid and smelled wet paper, iron, and something faintly medicinal underneath. Inside were oilskin-wrapped bundles, field notebooks, and a flat tin dispatch case with my uncle's initials scratched into the paint. I carried everything into the ruined lean-to shelter at the edge of camp and spread it across a bench that sagged in the middle. The oldest letters were carbon copies from the 70s between previous owners and guides. They spoke the way practical men speak when forced to mention something impossible without sounding drunk. Shift markers on West Shore. Do not put seasonal buoys on Blackwater alone. If crossed oars are found on the dock, cancel departures for 1 day. The language was coded but not yet corrupted. The intent was clear: keep people from dying. Then, over years, the tone changed. New rules appeared, with no authorship attached. If a canoe returns empty, store it indoors before sunrise. Those who ask about voices should not be corrected immediately. Marked individuals must not be permitted to remain alone at 7 after moonrise. If a guest returns with an extra passenger, charge only for the original group. Never ask the extra passenger's name. The more I read, the more sick I felt. Not because the rules were strange, but because their strangeness no longer pointed consistently toward human survival. Some clearly reduced direct encounters. Others seemed to formalize them, even accommodate them. One letter from my uncle to Marlon, never sent, had been written in a furious, uneven hand. We are curating conditions for it. Can't you see that? Every amended rule narrows our options and widens its reach. It learns what we obey. It learns where we won't go. Site 7 is not forbidden because it is dangerous to us. It is dangerous to the pattern. In a later notebook, he had organized his suspicion into columns. Original function / current function. Do not answer voices / trains people to accept voices as external, not internal. Do not wave back / establishes responsive threshold. Do not count canoes after sunset / prevents detection of additions. Charge only for original group / normalizes discrepancy. Discourages naming. No camping at 7. Preserves uncontrolled sight. At the bottom of the page. Conclusion. The system has been infiltrated. Whether by influence, imitation, or direct authorship, no longer matters. The rules now protect the continuity of the lake's behavior, not the people exposed to it. Another note, this one obviously written later and folded into the journal. The marked may disrupt it if uncontained. That is why they are watched, misled, or drawn back incomplete. If Evan returns as an adult, he is not to be guided by the compromised list alone. He must see the before and after. Rain drummed on the shelter roof. Beyond it, the lake lay dark and nearly motionless. I became aware, slowly and with dread, that I had not felt alone for several minutes. Someone stood just outside the open side of the shelter, not close, 10 yards away near the fire ring. A man in a rain jacket with the hood down. My uncle. That is what my mind said first, with the stupid certainty of recognition. Cal Holt, thinner than in memory, wet hair plastered to his forehead, eyes shadowed. He did not move. Rain passed through the space around him oddly, as if deciding too late where to fall. I stood so fast the bench tipped. He opened his mouth. No sound reached me. Then, from farther left on the shoreline, the same figure stood between 2 birches, and another beyond that, ankle deep in the water. Not 3 men, 3 placements, as if one presence had considered several approaches and not yet chosen. I backed into the cash box. Papers slid to the floor. One of the shoreline figures lifted its hand, not in a wave, but palm out, as though pressing against glass. Something beneath the water answered. Rings spread soundlessly from the shallows. A pale shape rolled just under the surface, vast and slow. I ran for the trail with my uncle's notebooks crammed under my jacket. Halfway back, I nearly collided with Marlon. He grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. What did you take? Proof. Of what? That the rules changed, that they serve it now. Rain streamed off his hat brim. For a second, his grip loosened, not from disbelief, but from the shock of hearing his private fear spoken plainly. I told Cal this, he said, years ago. Then why are you still following them? Because broken tools still cut. That answer might have satisfied me if not for what came next. From somewhere behind us on the trail, my uncle's voice said, Marlon, not loud, not theatrical, Just the ordinary way one man calls another from 50 feet away. Marlon went rigid. The color drained from his face so completely, it seemed to leave his lips last. "Don't turn," he said. "Was that, don't?" The voice came again, closer. "Marlon, you left the boy alone." The phrasing was intimate in a way horror rarely bothers to be. Not a threat. A criticism. Old familiarity sharpened into weaponry. I turned anyway. The trail behind us was empty except for rain and trees, and a length of white survey tape twisting from a branch. When I looked back, Marlon had his shotgun raised. Not at the trail, but at me. He held it there with grim, shaking certainty. "Give me the journals," he said. "Are you serious? I should have done this before you learned enough to think you had choices. You're pointing a gun at me because I read my uncle's notes. I'm pointing a gun at you because the last time a marked one understood what he was, 3 families vanished in a week." I stared at him. "There were others," he swallowed. "One that we know of. Jean Foster. She thought the old rules were a trap and tried to break the pattern open. She was right, in part. It nearly worked. Then Blackwater expanded 2 miles overnight and took the west launch." He blinked rain from his lashes without lowering the barrel. "Cal rebuilt the system after that. Compromised or not, it held." "Held what?" "Containment. Containment for something you're feeding." His face twisted. "You think I don't know that?" We stood in the rain with the truth between us at last, ugly and unsimplified. Marlon was not a believer preserving folklore. He was a custodian of a machine he no longer trusted, because he had seen what happened when it stopped running. My uncle had suspected the same rot, but kept working inside it, hoping maybe to salvage what protected people and strip out what protected the thing beneath the lake. And I, through no merit of my own, had arrived already threaded into the mechanism. Marlon lowered the gun first. "Come back to the lodge," he said hoarsely. "We burn what you found and we shut the place down. That's your answer. It's the only one left if you're what I think you are. What do you think I am?" His eyes flicked to the pale mark behind my ear, visible where rain had flattened my hair. "A door it remembers," he said. Thunder rolled far off, but no lightning followed. The air felt electrically wrong, charged without release. I should have gone back with him. I know that. Instead, I stepped away. "If the rules protect it," I said, "then maybe the only way to stop this is to break them." Marlon's expression became genuine alarm. "No." "Why? Because Jean tried? Because the lake learns from failed attacks? Then what do you want from me? To leave? To sell the place? To keep taking bookings until it grows by another mile?" He didn't answer quickly enough. That silence condemned him more than any confession. He had chosen managed sacrifice over uncontrolled catastrophe years ago, and perhaps he had been right then. But hearing it in the gap between us made me understand how thoroughly every adult around this place had rearranged morality to survive proximity. Behind us, somewhere deep among the cedars, paddling began, where no water existed. One stroke. Pause. Another. Marlon's head turned toward the sound despite himself. "Listen to me," he said urgently. "If it contacts you directly, do not accept any bargain. It will use blood memory. It will use your uncle's voice. It will tell you it was once human, because that part is true enough to be useful. And whatever you hear, do not go onto Blackwater alone at night." That, more than anything, told me I was going to do exactly that. Because by then every major truth in my life had arrived from people trying to control what I knew. I went back to the compound with the notebooks hidden under my shirt, and the growing certainty that my uncle had not left me a rule list at all. He had left me evidence. And evidence, if it isn't meant to free you, is meant to indict you. I just didn't know yet whether I was the witness or the accused. There is a point in prolonged fear where resistance stops feeling brave and starts feeling procedural. You keep moving, keep checking locks, keep making coffee, keep reading, because the alternative is to admit the world has already crossed some line your habits cannot follow. By the night I took a canoe onto Blackwater alone, I had reached that point. Marlon thought he had made it impossible. He hid the launch keys, chained the dock gate, and took position in the bunkhouse with the shotgun across his lap. I waited until after midnight, when the rain eased and the compound settled into that deceptive quiet, remote places where, before weather changes again. Then I walked to the warehouse, lifted one of the lighter canoes from its rack, and carried it down the shore by hand through reeds, until I found a low bank beyond the dock lights. I don't know whether I meant to confront the lake, my uncle, or myself. Those had ceased to be separate categories. The water accepted the canoe with barely a sound. Fog lay low over the center of the lake, not thick enough to obscure the far shore, only enough to make distance seem drafted in pencil. I paddled toward the middle, where the channels from the west and north opened together. After 10 minutes, the compound lights behind me seemed farther away than they should have. After 15, the shoreline ahead had not appreciably neared. The canoe moved. I could feel it, but the lake was behaving like a treadmill laid over depth. Then someone cleared his throat beside me. I did not jerk the paddle. I don't say that proudly. I was simply beyond surprise in the normal sense. My uncle's voice came from the water off the left bow, calm, slightly amused. The way he used to speak when I tied a knot wrong, and he wanted me to notice before he corrected it. "You still hold your top hand too tight," he said. I closed my eyes once, opened them, and kept paddling. "What are you?" Busy question. The voice shifted position without the sound of movement. Now behind me, now near the stern. "You know things only he would know," I said. He knew things only I would know. I stopped paddling. The canoe drifted without turning. Fog moved across the water in long strips. Inside one of them shapes seemed to form and unform. A canoe bow, a shoulder, the line of a cheek. None stayed long enough to claim. What happened to my uncle? A pause. He came too close to deciding. "That's not an answer." "No," the voice agreed. "It's a warning." Then it laughed softly, and grief hit me with an almost physical force, because it was his laugh, my uncle's private, rusty, genuine laugh, and no imitation should have been able to wear it so perfectly. I said, "Tell me why I survived." The lake beneath the canoe shivered, not with wave action, with a tension. "When you were 8, the voice said, you crossed where others fall. Some people pass over a threshold and are taken in pieces. Memory first, direction next, then name. Some arrive carrying a shape we can use. Most cannot bear being more than one life at once." It paused. "You almost could. We." The pronoun went through me colder than the air. "What are you?" I asked again. This time the answer came from multiple points on the lake at once. Voices layered inside the one I knew. Lost people, drowned people, those who starved on islands, and those who followed voices, and those who were carried under ice in years. Your maps forgot. We were hunger for a long time, then memory, then shoreline. Now something larger than either. I heard women in it. Men, a child. My uncle somewhere among them like a note inside a chord. "That's convenient," I said, forcing steadiness into my voice. "A monster with a tragic origin story. If I were only a monster, Marlon would be easier to forgive." The canoe began to move without my paddling. Not fast. Slowly, smoothly, toward the western dark where Site 7 should have been. I let it. What do you want from me? Completion, the voices said. Images came then, not in front of my eyes but inside them. Black water above like a lid, pale faces turning in slow suspension, reeds seen from below, a child's small hand reaching through light toward a surface that behaved like skin. Then another image over it, myself, older, standing on a dock with a notebook, watching names arrive. You weren't released, the lake said. You were interrupted. I thought of the mark behind my ear, the drawing my mother had saved, my uncle's note, set aside. You expect me to join you. Join is a human word. You are already partly here. The canoe glided into a patch of water, so still it reflected not the stars above, but a dim shoreline below, inverted and complete. Trees grew downward. A dock descended into darkness. Figures stood there motionless, looking up as if I were the one beneath them. I realized with sick awe that I was seeing not reflection but possibility, another arrangement of the same place layered under the one I knew. What happens if I refuse? I asked. The answer did not sound angry. Then the old cycle continues until someone less divided takes your place. More rules, more careful men, more selected losses. And if I accept, then you help us stop hiding. That was the most honest threat I had heard all week. A second voice entered then, harsh and human and unmistakably alive. Evan! Marlon's shout carried across the fog. A beam of light cut the dark from my right. He was in the aluminum boat, engine whining, shotgun laid across the bow. Get away from center water, he yelled. The voices around me sighed as one body might sigh when interrupted. He would rather feed strangers to a pattern than change it, my uncle's voice said near my ear. Marlon drew alongside, face gaunt with terror and fury. Paddle to me, now. I looked between the man and the dark water. Did you know it talks? I asked. I knew enough. It says it was once people. It says what keeps you listening. You kept the rules going even after you knew they were compromised. His jaw clenched. Because when Jean broke them, we lost half the West Shore. That's not an answer. That's fear. It's experience. He killed his engine and let the boats drift close. Listen carefully. At dawn I can still isolate the area. Blow the markers. Drop the west launch. Cut the path to 7 and sink every spare canoe. We can starve the pattern until winter. And the guests next season? The town, the people who already heard it. He looked as if he wanted to shake me. Better a wound than an opening. The lake answered through the hull beneath me. My uncle's voice turned intimate. Or you could end the old lie. I asked Marlon. What if the rules are the structure it relies on? What if we don't preserve them or carefully suspend them? What if we erase them all? His face changed so completely, I knew I had reached the thought he feared most. No, he said. Why? Because if it loses its channels suddenly, it won't know where to stay. Good. Evan, he leaned toward me. You think vulnerability is always symmetrical. It isn't. If you break the system, you break the walls between what it can reach and what reaches back. The voices in the lake murmured approval, amusement, hunger. I couldn't separate them. Of course Marlon was right to fear that. Of course the entity wanted any decisive act that replaced managed repetition with open change. But another truth had become unavoidable. Keeping the compromised system in place guaranteed the thing beneath Blackwater remained the hunter, and the humans around it remained its curated prey. I was tired of being curated. The choice before me was not good versus evil. It was containment versus mutation, service versus surrender, inheritance versus authorship. My uncle had spent years trying to decipher which rules still belonged to people and which belonged to the lake. He had died in the attempt. Maybe the only honest answer left was to stop obeying the language altogether. I backed my canoe away from Marlon. His hand went to the flare gun at his belt. "Don't," I said. "Come in now." "No." The voices rose, not in triumph but in keen attention. "What are you going to do?" Marlon asked. I heard my own answer before I fully formed it. "Destroy every rule it recognizes." The flare gun came up. So did my uncle's voice from the water, soft and almost proud. "There you are." I reached the compound ahead of Marlon only because the lake helped me once and betrayed him once. That is the simplest way to say it. My canoe traveled light and true through a channel of smooth water, while his aluminum boat lost steerage twice in weed beds that should not have existed in open lake. I do not tell that as evidence of favor. Predators often ease the path of the hand reaching toward the trap. By the time I dragged my canoe ashore behind the warehouse, Marlon was still 100 yards out, cursing at an engine that had begun to sputter. I ran for the office with the notebooks under my arm, unlocked the door, and went straight to the records room. My uncle had preserved everything: journals, route logs, amended rule sheets, guest incidents, marked maps, correspondence bundles, a lifetime of documentation, part warning and part scaffolding. He had hoped understanding might produce a cleaner solution than destruction. Maybe that hope was the last human thing the lake exploited in him. I started tearing pages, not reading now, not sorting, just ripping notebooks from shelves, splitting bindings, dumping files into the metal trash barrel by the desk. Old paper has a specific smell when disturbed. Dust, glue, the faint, dry sweetness of decay arrested in drawers. The room filled with it. I doused the first armful with lamp oil from the storm cabinet and struck a match. Fire took reluctantly, then greedily. The flame licked through my uncle's block handwriting, curled maps inward, blackened dates, 8 rules that had governed arrivals and disappearances longer than I'd been alive. Smoke rolled across the ceiling. The office bell shook when the first window cracked from heat. Marlon hit the front door hard enough to rattle the frame. "Open it." I ignored him and kept feeding the barrel. On one half-burned page, I saw the line, "The marked may invert certain thresholds," before it vanished into red. That phrase mattered. I knew it even then, not because I understood it, but because my body had already begun acting, as if old directions no longer pointed the same way for me. Where others were lured, I was delayed. Where others vanished, I was preserved. If the rules had become channels through which the entity distributed risk and contact, then destroying them might deny it the predictability it had taught generations of caretakers to maintain. Or it might free it. I carried burning folders into the yard and piled them on the gravel between the lodge and the dock, while rain hissed at the edges of the flames. The fire burned hotter than weather should have allowed, white in the core. Marlon came around the side of the building, shotgun in one hand, flare gun in the other, soaked through and wild-eyed. "Stop!" He lunged for a stack of route maps. I shoved him back. Years of guiding and hauling boats made him stronger than me, but panic had given me speed. We slipped in mud, grappling like idiots beside the burning heap, while ash rose and blew toward Blackwater. "You don't know what line you're cutting," he shouted. "Neither did you!" I knew enough to keep it sleeping. From the lake came a sound like many paddles striking water at once. We both froze. Out on Blackwater, lights were appearing. Small yellow points spread in a curve from the North Channel to the West Bay. Lanterns, dozens of them, too low and too steady to be stars, too silent to be boats carrying ordinary people. They moved without wake, Marlon made a broken sound in his throat. God, no, I said, and meant it. I ran to the dock. The old signboards my uncle kept for guests. Rules, routes, check-in times, portage notes were stacked in the west shed with extra marker posts and paint cans. Marlon understood where I was headed before I reached it. Evan, listen to me. I smashed the padlock with a maul from the tool rack and dragged the boards out one by one. Some were harmless, some were practical, some carried phrases I now suspected had functioned like prayers spoken in the lake's grammar. No guests at Site 7 wait. If you hear paddling count, all boats before launch, / never after dark. That last one had always bothered me. A system that forbids counting additions does not protect the counted. I fed them all to the fire. The first true change came then. Not dramatic, not at first. The shoreline across the inlet shifted by inches, then feet. Trees seeming to slide apart and rejoin without falling. The boathouse reflection in the water remained where the boathouse no longer stood. The north channel widened and narrowed in alternating pulses, as if the lake were drawing test breaths through a newly opened throat. Marlon grabbed me by the collar and spun me around. Look! Site 7's island was visible from the dock now, though it should have been hidden by the western point. It moved slowly sideways across open water, carrying its dead fire ring and tilted sign like furniture on a raft. Behind it, another shape surfaced, an island or the memory of one, then dissolved back into black. The lantern line on the lake had stopped advancing. For the first time, I sensed confusion in the presence beneath the water. Not pain exactly, not fear, disruption. A large intelligence finding that familiar